Well, welcome to Reynolda. If I haven't met you before, my name is Chris. I'm our executive pastor. We're sure glad to be with you this weekend, wherever you're worshiping with us. Maybe you're worshiping at the Village campus on Saturday night, joining us online. Maybe you're at the Village campus, or you're at Clemens, or you're at Union Cross, or maybe you're with the team that's just launching our campus in King. We're so proud of you guys, hearing great stories of what God's doing in King. Are you ready for some good news?
Yes.
Life is hard. I mean, it's hard. And for some here today, it may feel crushing. There are good reasons to worry about the battles you face. In fact, you probably should, unless it really isn't your battle at all. What if your battle belongs to the Lord? One of the problems of growing up first in the word processor and then in the personal computer age is that you don't grow up with the necessity of knowing how to spell anything. Autocorrect fixes everything for my children. But since I was a small kid, I've been fascinated with the origin of words and what words mean. Let me introduce you to John Montague, a degenerate gambler who would be so reluctant to get up from the poker table that he wanted people to bring his lunch to him. So he created a food of convenience. His hot beef sandwich was named after him. After day, the Earl of Sandwich asked if people would bring him his hot meat between two pieces of bread. That's where we get that word from. The word jumbo was developed in 1880 when P.T. Barnum bought an elephant named Jumbo from the Royal Zoological Society in London. By age 7, the pachyderm consumed nearly 200 pounds of hay, 1 barrel of potatoes, 2 bushels of oats, 15 loaves of bread, a slew of onions, and several pails of water every day. His caretaker was also known to sneak him a little whiskey on occasion. Nimrod originally meant skillful hunter. The word comes from Nimrod, the great-grandson of Noah. But during the golden age of American animation, Bugs Bunny called Elmer Fudd a Nimrod in an episode of Looney Tunes. It's kind of like calling your friend Einstein when they do something stupid. Old Bugs Bunny changed the definition of the word Nimrod. My maternal grandfather shaped who I am in a lot of ways, including giving me this rather impressive head of hair. But some of the things that he said when we were growing up, we found fascinating. For instance, he would frequently call these things in his backyard water chickens. You know what a water chicken is? It's a duck. He also would hear his favorite grandson singing. I love to sing. I sing all the time. There's just one problem. I can't sing at all. So it was from him that I first heard the phrase, he couldn't carry a tune in a bucket. When he'd get mad at us, which was more frequent than I would like to admit, he would say, I'm madder than a mule chewing bumblebees. He would also get really excited and say, jumping Jehoshaphat. One of the speculations about the etymology of jumping Jehoshaphat is that the Torah scholars would attribute this to King Jehoshaphat, who, when a great Bible teacher would enter into his court, he would jump off of his throne to meet them. There's little evidence to suggest that that's true. In fact, we probably got that phrase from the Irish-American writer Thomas Reed, who used the phrase in 1866 in his book called The Headless Horseman. I once asked my grandfather, where did he get this phrase from, assuming that I would get some rather sophisticated answer. Instead, he said that he heard it once in an old series called Car 54, Where Are You? Turns out that the character Francis Muldoon cited his partner's frequent use of the phrase, jumping Jehoshaphat. Not sure that he was a jumper, but the story of King Jehoshaphat has long fascinated me. It's a small little story tucked in 2 Chronicles. If you'd like to turn there with me this day to 2 Chronicles chapter 20. Let's be honest. Chronicles is set in the middle of a bunch of books that we skip when we're reading through the Bible. After all, 1st and 2nd Kings and 1st and 2nd Chronicles is populated primarily with names that we can't pronounce. But the author of Chronicles gives us an extended focus on the themes of Israel's kings and their temple. The assumption is that Israel's future growth and fruitfulness would depend, 1, on its leadership, and 2, on the ability to participate in the life of Israel's temple. The sad history, though, that unfolds here in 1st and 2nd Chronicles is one of repeated failure by the kings. Despite some bright spots like Jehoshaphat and Josiah and Hezekiah, the kings lead eventually to the destruction of the temple. Likely that many of the readers of this book will place this story post being in Babylon as God's people are returning from exile to the promised land. In this we find instructions about what living under God's reign and his kingdom might look like. I begin reading today from 2 Chronicles chapter 20, verses 1 through 4. After this, the Moabites and the Ammonites, with them some of the Meunites, came against Jehoshaphat for battle. Some men came and told Jehoshaphat, "A great multitude is coming against you from Edom, from beyond the sea. And behold, they are in Hazazon Tamar." This is En Gedi. Jehoshaphat is one of the good kings. Like his father, King Asa, there is much in his reign that benefited Israel. Later we will find that the unraveling of his kingdom came when he made a naive agreement with Jezebel. Never a good idea in the Bible to align yourself with Jezebel. Jezebel is so bad that she's probably the last person in human history that was named Jezebel, right? That's how bad her story is. As a matter of fact, you will frequently come across people who will name their kid Judas. Judas is the guy who sold Jesus to the authorities to be executed. Yet Jezebel's so bad in human history, nobody names their kid that. And naively, Jehoshaphat will one day make an alliance with her. But here he sees that the foreign armies are beginning to surround him, and he picks up in the next verse, verse 5. Then Jehoshaphat was afraid and set his face to seek the Lord and proclaimed a fast throughout all of Judah. And Judah assembled to seek help from the Lord. From all the cities of Judah, they came to seek the Lord. Ammon, Edom were on the move, and their destination was Jerusalem. You see, these cities were the descendants of the same people that Israel was descendant from. The Moabites and the Ammonites were descendants of Lot, and the Edomites were the descendants of Esau. But this was no family reunion that was about to happen. They were en route to slaughter the Israelites. On the south and on the east, they were surrounded by these lands. Now, David and Solomon had made alliances with them at times, and at other times he'd brought them in, David and Solomon had, to be indentured servants in the land. But at this point in the history of Israel, the kingdom is divided north and south. Because following the reign of David and Solomon, the kingdom is divided north and south under the leadership of Rehoboam and Jeroboam. The northern kingdom had just faced an excruciating, extended battle with Syria. And they were still licking their wounds from that. And so the southern kingdom of Judah was exposed for the first time in its history. And so these armies in the south and in the east knew it was their moment to be able to come in and take advantage of Judah. They could crush them in their moment of weakness. And they could take the wealth that had been given to Jehoshaphat by his father, King Asa. After that, there was going to be an impending attack. And Jehoshaphat knew no way to get himself out of that. So in verse 5, we pick up, and Jehoshaphat stood in the assembly of Judah in Jerusalem in the house of the Lord before the new court and said, O Lord God of our fathers, are you not God in heaven? You rule over all the kingdoms of the nations. In your hand are power and might, so that none is able to withstand you. He continued in verse 7, did you not, our God, drive out the inhabitants of this land before your people Israel and give it forever to the descendants of Abraham, your friend? Jehoshaphat, like any kid who grew up in Israel, could recount God's faithfulness. He had experienced it as the son of Asa. But in his mind, the kingdom of Judah was about to be swept away if he didn't get some very significant help. Tens of thousands of his family and friends would in an instant be destroyed. And everyone was looking to him to do something. And his options were very limited. He might have tried to negotiate a surrender, but he knew that they wouldn't trust him because they had the upper hand. He thought that he might send a pile of money there. His father had tried something similar with Syria. But what story I think he recounted was the time in which God provided victory over the army of Ethiopia. There was a time in which there were 1 million Ethiopian soldiers bearing down on Israel, and God provided victory for them. And I think he knows this story in his mind, and so he clings to the only thing he knows to cling to, and that is the covenant that God made with Abraham. I wonder how many Israelite children would have grown up laying on their backs in the land of God, looking at the stars and trying to figure out which one of the stars in the sky that God had promised Abraham they were. God had pulled Abraham out at night and showed him the sky and showed him the vastness of the stars and said, your descendants will be like these stars. Jehoshaphat was one of those stars elevated in the sky. And so he's clinging to the only thing that the children of Israel could ever cling to, that they were descendants of Abraham. How could God's covenant with Israel be true if God allowed the grieving and recovering northern kingdom to fall and the southern kingdom to be destroyed? How would they fulfill God's covenantal promises to Abraham if God allowed them to die? We pick up in verse 13. Meanwhile, all of Judah stood before the Lord with their little ones, their wives, and their children. And the Spirit of the Lord came upon Jehaziel in the midst of the assembly. And he said, listen, all of Judah and the inhabitants of Jerusalem and King Jehoshaphat. Thus says the Lord to you, do not be afraid, and do not be dismayed at the great horde, for this battle is not yours, but God's. Verse 17. You will not need to fight in this battle. Stand firm, hold your position, and see the salvation of the Lord on your behalf. O Judah and Jerusalem, do not be afraid and do not be dismayed. Tomorrow go out against them, and the Lord will be with you. Then Jehoshaphat bowed his head with his face to the ground, and all of Judah and the inhabitants of Jerusalem fell down before the Lord, worshiping the Lord. The wonderful thing about Jehoshaphat was that he really did trust God. He really was recounting God's faithfulness, his promises. He did believe that not only could God rescue Judah, but God would rescue Judah. And in this case, he realized that he didn't have many alternatives. Have you ever found in your life that limited options is sometimes the mercy of God. I mean, sometimes I find when there are too many options, it's crippling. Occasionally, I make the fatal mistake, I might call it naive mistake, of taking my 5-year-old to Target. Like I negotiate some truce with the 5-year-old that ends up with the bounty being, listen, if we get through the day, you and I will go to Target and we'll pick out a toy. It's the most painful thing I do in my life, taking the 5-year-old to the 11 rows of toys at Target, right? Because he is absolutely crippled with all the choices. He is so convinced that any choice he makes is the assurance that he is missing out on something greater that must be just one aisle away. That last time I was toy shopping with him, I just went over to the furniture section, grabbed a beanbag, brought it over, and sat down in it because I'd just given up. Whenever you make a decision, Zachary, you come back to me. He would be much better served by me going in, picking out 2 or 3 things, bringing them to the car, letting him pick one of those things and returning the other 2 things. Because he is crippled by the number of choices. Sometimes when we look at our own stories, the variety of options, the potential pitfalls and choices almost become crippling to us. I think in a very real way, Jehoshaphat here is thankful that the only way out of this situation is that the Lord gets him out of it. One of my friends and I were processing a situation that we found ourselves stuck in sometime in May of this year, and we had no idea how we were going to get out of it. As a matter of fact, the predicament of the situation felt so overwhelming that she told me, she said, listen, in my family when we were growing up and something like this would happen, she said, my dad had this habit. He'd say, well, Lord, I found myself here and I have no way out. I found myself here in a predicament, Lord. Get me out of this. I think Jehoshaphat was probably thankful that in the end, there's really no decision to make other than trust the Lord. Get me out of this, Lord. Pick up in verse 20. And they rose early in the morning and went out into the wilderness of Tekoa. And when they went out, Jehoshaphat stood and said, hear me, Judah and inhabitants of Jerusalem. Believe in the Lord your God, and you will be established. Believe in his prophets, and you will succeed. Verse 21. When he had taken counsel with the people, he appointed those who were to sing to the Lord and praise his holy attire. As they went before the army and said, give thanks to the Lord, for his steadfast love endures forever. And verse 22. When they began to sing and praise, the Lord set an ambush against the men of Ammon and Moab and Mount Seir who had come against Judah, so that they were routed. For the men of Ammon and Moab rose up against the inhabitants of Mount Seir, devoting them to destruction. And when they had made an end of the inhabitants of Seir, they all helped to destroy one another. This is one of my favorite stories in the whole Bible. God answered Jehoshaphat's faith-filled prayer in a spectacular way. He threw the armies of Ammon and Moab and Edom, who are the inhabitants of Mount Seir, into such confusion that they slaughtered one another, while the people of Judah stood on the hillside and sang. The destruction of these 3 armies was so thorough that it took the people of Judah 3 days just to carry away the new treasure. This is probably the time that Jehoshaphat started jumping. See, the keys to Jehoshaphat's victory are clear. First, he recounts to the people of Judah God's faithfulness by clinging to the unfailing covenantal promise that God had made to Abraham. The promise that God had made to Abraham, that had been claimed by Isaac, expressed by Jacob, clung to by Joseph, led the people out of captivity through Moses. And now these kings who devoted themselves to the Lord's work in Judah were seeing that the Lord was faithful to his promise. And so they could recount it as an assurance of his faithfulness in the future. But not only were they surrendering here, not just to God. I mean, it's one thing to say, God, you are in charge, you are sovereign, you are good, and so I surrender to you. But they were also surrendering to their deep need for rescue. Not just, God, are you in charge, but God, we are here and we don't know how we're getting out. And so all we can do is praise you. This is why James 1:2 says, that's why we count it all joy when we meet trials of various kind. Jehoshaphat says to the people of Judah, let your praises chase away the devil. We're going to recount the story. We're going to surrender to our need for rescue, which is humbling. And we're going to allow our praises of recounting God's story to chase away the devil. My children love the beach. I mean, love the beach. This was a big year in our family because the 5-year-old's finally a good enough swimmer that we introduced him to wave crashing. This is my kids' favorite thing to do. They would do it until we had to drag them back into their beds. They're so exhausted. They will play in the ocean for hours and hours and hours and hours. And we've created kind of some inside language in our family for the ways in which we play in the waves. And one of the principles we use when we're joking about playing in the waves is this thing called the principle of the second wave. The principle of the second wave. And it basically means this. Even on the roughest day in the ocean, you can withstand the first wave. It's never the first wave that bounces you off the bottom of the ocean. It's after the first wave has come by and you're gathering yourself and you stop paying attention for 1 second and the second wave crushes you. Because it's always the second wave that gets you. We can withstand the first wave, but when you're still getting the water out of your eyes and getting your shorts back up over your hips, it's the second wave that always gets you. So in our family, we call that the principle of the second wave. That the first wave, we've got enough to withstand. But it's the second wave that comes at us that gets us. That's how life works. We've got enough in us to withstand the one thing that's coming at us. But that's never how the devil comes at us. The devil never just throws one thing at us. He throws one thing at us, and while we're focused on that, he blindsides us with another thing. And while we're holding those two plates in the air, he gets us from behind with a third thing. Wave after wave after wave of attack from the enemy. I grew up going to the beach. It was probably the first beach trip that we ever took as a family after my parents got divorced. And for my dad, it must have been the great respite in the middle of a summer of trying to juggle, figuring out what new life looked like as he was single parenting and my grandparents were involved. And we went to the beach for the week. And if he were being honest, the best thing about the beach is that the ocean will babysit your kids. And so he set up early in the morning an umbrella and a cooler with food and drinks and his book next to his chair. And his boys are going to play the whole day and be so tired by the end of the day that all he's got to do is slide them under the sheets to the next day. It's his oasis in the middle of a hectic and busy summer. And we had one rule, which is, boys, don't get close to that pier. Now, the problem was that earlier that day, I had seen a guy catch a shark on that pier. And he just kicked that baby shark right off the ledge of the pier, right back into the water. And so I thought, there must be some baby sharks over there near that pier. I'd like to see those fish. And so I went over there. Piers are an interesting thing. Something strange happens to suspension posts of a fishing pier over time. The nicely finished, weather-treated post that extends some 6 feet into the ground carry the weight of walking pedestrians, novice fishermen, and spectators. And they begin to attract, these posts do, a particularly nasty parasite, a barnacle. There are nearly 900 species of crustacea worldwide, and the North Carolina coastline is liberally adorned with these often unnoticed animals. Although the majority are what scientists call free living, many take up residence on the bellies of large fish and burrow into the sand near intertidal grass. Ironically, a barnacle has a soft body cavity that is protected by a calcite shell. Because these sea dwellers require both the sun and the sea, they frequently attach themselves to the non-threatening, sun-exposed pier post, where the changing tide gives them life. As soon as I got near, the waves slammed my little body against the post, and the sun-bathing barnacles ripped into my chest. With every shift of my weight, the tiny sea creatures reminded me that I was not welcome there. As I clung to that post, and the sand beneath my soft feet continued to wash away and give me no place to stand, I heard the most peace-giving thing I'd ever heard. My Father's voice in my ear saying, "I've got you." It was my disobedience that led to my helplessness. And it was a battle I was going to lose. Jehoshaphat looked at the landscape of Israel and acknowledged their helplessness. And he had two options: worry or trust. The list of things that incite worry in our lives is almost without end. Work, school, personal relationships with family and spouses, money, emotional trauma such as the death of a loved one, past abuse from family or friend or spouse, serious medical illness, side effects of medication, use of substances to self-medicate. But in the end, the source of almost all worry is uncertainty. Uncertainty around work or finances, uncertainty around relationships, uncertainty around our own physical health. And it rolls in on us like waves. Most of us can handle one crisis, but that's never how life comes at us. Next thing we know, we turn around and we're just holding on. Jehoshaphat understood what it meant to be attacked by the enemy by wave after wave after wave. foreign alliances through Solomon had divided the kingdom. And he knew that mere miles away, the northern kingdom was burning. He was ruling Judah and didn't know which way to turn. And there are invading armies literally gathering at the border to the east and the south. And he recounts to the people of Judah God's faithfulness that stretched back to their founding father, Abraham. And then he acknowledges that he doesn't have the answer. And he says, surrender to your need to be rescued. And then he says, exalt the name of God. And watch what he's about to do. He knew because he had heard the stories of God's faithfulness, but he also knew that their story would never end with simply recounting and surrendering and praising, that something much deeper had to happen. And in the end, he acknowledged that the battle wasn't his at all. The only truth that would reduce Jehoshaphat's worry was a wonder-working power. And God says to Jehoshaphat, I've got this. Even if that means that your enemy has to destroy itself. Judah is surrounded by the descendants of Lot and Esau. And they hated the descendants of Jacob. They hated everything that God's people stood for. And so not only did they curse them, not only did they shout vile things at them from the border, but they sought to wipe them off the face of the earth. The enemies of God sought to destroy the very thing that would tell of God's faithfulness to a world that was looking for hope. And Jehoshaphat hears from the Lord that this battle doesn't belong to him. And in one of the more remarkable turns of events in all of Scripture, while wave after wave after wave that was intended to destroy Judah came at them, God says, I've got this. And he confuses the mind of these three armies, and they turn on each other and destroy themselves. The very thing they thought would destroy Judah, in the end, was the thing that destroyed them. As they lifted their voices and raised their weapons of destruction against the children of God, God took those weapons and destroyed them. When they lifted their hands, they were assuring the victory of God's people. The devil thought he had won on Friday night. The devil thought, I've got him. I turned the heart of one of his own followers against him. And he ratted him out for a pocket full of change. And then they held Jesus like a criminal in the middle of the night before an illegal trial. And when they asked him, who are you? Are you the king of the Jews? Jesus will not fall for their trap. And they send Jesus off to the populated city and the hillside where on the day that Jesus dies, 1,500 other people are executed by Rome. No one killed like Rome. Jesus hangs there on the hillside of Golgotha. And Satan watches as those beneath his feet gamble for his clothes and mock him for the words that hung above his head. If you're the king of the Jews, bring yourself down, they said. But Jesus knew that as they lifted their voices and lifted their hands to destroy him, God was about to change the narrative and use the thing that they thought would secure their victory to actually secure God's. They thought Jesus' death would end his story. But they didn't know that when they raised their hand against God's only begotten, it only assured his victory. The battle of your story is too hard. Life is hard. You have an adversary who spends every moment of his existence trying to destroy you. You should be worried. Unless it was never your fight to start with. What if all along the battle belonged to the Lord? And the very thing that the enemy is trying to convince you will destroy you is the very thing God's going to use to assure you of your victory. When God restores your marriage, when God brings your wayward kid home, when God heals your body, soothes your soul, when God provides provision for you when you knew no way out, when God shifts the whole narrative of your story, when God undoes the very thing the enemy tried to use to destroy you, it's going to be the assurance that not only does your worry go away, but God's victory over the enemy is the story the world needs to hear, that there is another way, that God is in control, that there is nothing that happens that's outside of his hand. The very thing the enemy meant for you to destroy you, to cause you anxiety and worry, is the very story that God's going to turn around. And we know that is promised because we know that the devil tried to destroy God's own Son. And on Easter Sunday morning, Jesus got up so that every day you can surrender everything to him, and the Father can reach down his hands and say, I've got this. This battle's not yours. The battle belongs to the Lord. Worry not. I'm king, and this is the king's fight. And that's the gospel.